The year is 1943. The moon, cold and different disk in the Mediterranean sky, casts silver onto the black, oily waves. Somewhere off the coast of Sicily, a German U-boat, U-128, was running silent and deep. Commander Klaus Richter, a man whose face was etched with 3 years of Atlantic tension, gripped the periscope handles. He felt safe. The Allied air patrols had been frustratingly sporadic all evening. Standard radar sweep nothing more than a minor annoyance that his sophisticated METOX receiver easily spotted and countermeasured. METOX was their secret weapon. It listened to the British detection waves, turning Allied eyes into German warning bells. Richter permitted himself a small, silent smile. The British believed they were hunting a phantom down in the cramped control room. The air was thick with diesel and sweat, yet a sense of professional pride permeated the space. They were the apex predators of the deep. They had just sunk to heavily loaded Allied transports carrying crucial supplies for the upcoming Italian campaign. Richter believed the greatest danger had passed. He ordered a shallow ascent to recharge batteries. This was the moment of hubris. What Richter did not know, what the entire German command laughed at when initial reports came in, was the small, almost insignificant device now being fitted to the wings of every new Allied patrol aircraft. A tiny modification, a secondary frequency sweep, designed not for detection, but for deception. Suddenly, a petty officer monitoring the METOX receiver stiffened. He heard the faint, telltale static of Allied radar, the standard Wurzburg frequency. Contact, Herr Commandant. 2 kilometers, starboard, standard sweep. Richter nodded, calm. They had minutes. Plenty of time to dive and evade the predictable pattern. But beneath the expected signal, buried in the noise that the German technology was programmed to ignore, was a ghost. A second. Ultra-high frequency, ping the ghost radar. It was a frequency deliberately calibrated to mimic natural atmospheric static, registering nothing on the METOX as a threat. The German system classified it as background noise harmless. The Allies had found a way to be invisible to the very system designed to unmask them. Richter shouted the order to dive, but it was already too late. In reality, the Allied aircraft was not 2 kilometers away. It was directly above them. The ghost signal was the only true one. The ensuing depth charge dropped with chilling accuracy, slammed into the water just meters from the hull. The explosion ripped through the vessel, sending the entire crew stumbling. This single, small innovation this ghost signaled did not just damage a U-boat. It shattered the psychological shield of the German naval command. They thought they were invisible, but no one is invisible to history. This singular incident was not isolated. It was the first echo of a systematic collapse. A catastrophic failure of the German naval doctrine that would eventually lead to the loss of over 20 U-boats in a single month, and ultimately doomed 40,000 men across various fronts, sealing the fate of the Mediterranean supply lines. In just a few minutes, you'll understand why this tiny, unheard frequency changed the direction of the entire war. And just when Commander Richter felt the safest, believing his technology was superior, a strange, unheard signal sealed his fate. The story you are about to hear has never appeared in any official document in its terrible entirety. The year is 1943, and the stage is set across the treacherous waters of the Mediterranean Sea and the rugged terrain of southern Italy. This is the opening act of Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. The timeline stretches from the spring of 1943, when the U-boat threat was still considered dominant, through to the critical landings in July. The geography is unforgiving. Open sea lanes, heavily fortified coastal defenses, and mountainous inland regions providing natural strongholds for the Axis forces. The scale of the forces involved was staggering. The Allies, commanded by Generals Eisenhower and Alexander, amassed a combined force of over 160,000 troops for the initial landing, supported by 2,590 vessels, including battleships, aircraft carriers, and destroyers, making it one of the largest amphibious operations of the war up to that point. The air support was overwhelming, with over 4,000 aircraft dedicated to securing the skies and covering the landing zones. The objective was clear: seize the island of Sicily to force Italy out of the war, secure Mediterranean shipping lanes, and divert German forces away from the coming battle in the east. The Axis defenses, primarily Italian and German, were formidable but fractured. The Italian forces, estimated at around 300,000 men, were often poorly equipped and demoralized. Crucially, they were backed by approximately 40,000 highly effective German soldiers, including 2 panzer divisions and elite motorized infantry. Their strategy relied on coastal defense and a swift, brutal counterattack by mobile German divisions inland. Initial casualty projections were grim. The Allies anticipated up to 10,000 casualties in the first wave alone. Based on historical amphibious assault success rates, the climate and terrain played a critical role. The intense summer heat of the Mediterranean was physically draining. The terrain, particularly the treacherous Strait of Messina and the slopes of Mount Etna, it turned the advance into a grinding, slow-motion battle, heavily favoring the defenders. In the German headquarters deep within Italy, confidence remained high, bordering on arrogance. Their faith was placed in the Medox receiver, the technology that had kept their U-boats invisible for 2 years. A German admiral's report dated April 1943 captured this sentiment. Our subsurface dominance is secured by our electronic countermeasures. The British radar is blunt and predictable. Till they find a new frequency, the Atlantic and Mediterranean remain our hunting grounds. German command laughed at any suggestion that the Allied counter-technology could be meaningful. This hubris fueled their strategic approach. They positioned their U-boats not merely as attackers, but as an impenetrable electronic screen. Their psychological objective was to maintain a state of perpetual fear among Allied convoy crews, forcing them into inefficient routes. Their main operational goal was to sever the Allied supply line before the invasion could gain momentum. The Allies, however, were not only massing physical forces, but also employing an elaborate deception campaign, mincemeat to confuse the German high command about the actual landing site. While mincemeat distracted them, the secret weapon was already in place: the Allied Ghost Radar. This was the deployment of the H-2S airborne radar and, critically, the introduction of the new ASV-MK3 radar on patrol aircraft. The ASV-MK3 operated in the S-band, a frequency the METOX was blind to. More subtle and devastating was the intentional use of a modified secondary sweep that mimicked atmospheric noise, the ghost signal. This signal provided Allied air crews with a clean operational window, while simultaneously reassuring German operators that their METOX was functioning perfectly, picking up only the harmless static. This intelligence error was profound.
Under the blinding
German
light
strategy
of the
was
Sicilian
predicated on their
sun,
electronic
the heat
superiority.
haze rising
When the
from
U-boats were
volcanic
sunk one
rock
after another,
presents
the
a
German high
formidable
command attributed the
physical
losses to
challenge.
bad luck or poor seamanship. Failing to grasp the fundamental technological shift, the expected casualty numbers were based on fighting a highly effective, electronically shielded enemy. What actually occurred was the systematic destruction of the German U-boat
Dated
fleet in the region,
1943,
causing a collapse in
this
intelligence
report
gathering and naval
details the
escort defense.
specifications of the METOX
In the span of 6 weeks, the Allies lost only 4 convoys, while the German Kriegsmarine lost over 20 U-boats in the Atlantic and Mediterranean combined, disproportionately in the latter. A previously unseen letter from a U-boat commander to his family, smuggled out before his last patrol, revealed an unsettling sense of foreboding. Despite the official confidence, we are told we are masters of the deep, Klaus. But the silence now is too heavy. It is not the sound of the enemy's radar that worries me. It is the total lack of any sound. It feels like they are moving in shadows we cannot perceive. That perceived shadow was the ghost radar. No one knew why that. Radar signal appeared or failed to appear on the German receivers until years later, when the full extent of the electronic warfare program was declassified. This was only the surface of a storm, quietly changing direction, diverting German attention to the deceptive mincemeat operation, while the real, silent killer technological blindness was decimating their submarine defenses, thereby guaranteeing the success of the invasion before a single Allied soldier set foot on the Sicilian beach. The logistics of Operation Husky were as monumental as the forces involved. and their success hinged entirely on uninterrupted supply. The Allies operated a complex system of forward supply depots and meticulously timed convoys, maintaining a supply rate of approximately 7,000 tons of materiel per day into the combat zone. The vulnerability of this supply chain was the primary target of the German command. Politically, the invasion of Sicily was also a high-stakes gamble for Churchill and Roosevelt. A failure could drastically shift public opinion against continuing the war in Europe. This pressure led to internal disputes, particularly between the British, who favored a strategy of continued pressure on the Mediterranean, and the Americans, who were focused on the cross-channel invasion of France. The decision to prioritize Sicily, though strategically sound, was a constant source of friction, intensifying the need for decisive, quick victories. Within the German and Italian command structure, the dynamics were far more corrosive. The Italian forces were plagued by low morale, outdated equipment, and a command structure increasingly distrustful of Mussolini's regime. Their weapons, primarily World War I, Nera, artillery, and poorly armored tanks, were no match for the Sherman and Churchill tanks being unloaded daily by the Allies. The German forces, though elite and highly motivated, suffered from logistical overstretch and a fatal flaw in intelligence prioritization. Grand Admiral Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, consistently dismissed reports of new Allied radar technology, convinced that the METOX was foolproof. This intellectual rigidity at the highest level meant the new generation of Allied ASVMK-3 and the associated ghost frequency was never seriously analyzed as a technological threat. Instead, losses were blamed on poor weather or betrayal. This internal dispute strategy versus intelligence was a silent killer. Weapon deployment reflected this technical blindness. German coastal defenses relied heavily on stationary Wurzburg radar systems, which, like the METOX, operated on frequencies as Lee identifiable and, more importantly, easily saturated or avoided by the new Allied systems. The German deployment of mobile panzer divisions was fast able to travel up to 300 kilometers in 72 hours, but their movement was constantly hampered by the precision of Allied air interdiction, which, thanks to the undetected Ghost radar's aerial reconnaissance, knew exactly where to strike. The serrated wings of the Allied aircraft cut through the rain as soldiers stepped onto the deck. Torn between fear and anticipation, they relied on their technological edge, an edge the enemy refused to acknowledge. Was this strategy or a desperate gamble? For the German side, it was a strategy based on outdated assumptions, essentially gambling that the enemy's technology had remained static. For the Allies, the use of deception and electronic countermeasures, exploiting a hidden, unknown weakness, was the ultimate strategic maneuver. The failure of the Axis logistics was stark, while Allied convoys steamed steadily. German fuel and ammunition trains were delayed by an average of 6 hours, per crucial movement due to air superiority they could not track. They didn't know that decades later, this specific frequency manipulation technology would appear in advanced forms in systems used for modern communication, and even, arguably, in simplified microchip architecture found in devices like your smartphone. The fundamental lesson was the same. Invisibility is power. Behind the numbers and maps were people about to step into a storm, unaware that the quiet electronic war had already predetermined the outcome. The chilling reality of the Ghost radar first registered not in a high-command bunker, but in the panic-stricken face of a survivor. Petty Officer Jürgen Voss was one of the few men pulled from the oily wreckage of the U-128 off Sicily. He was a radio man, a professional listener. His testimony, recorded much later by Allied interrogators, painted a picture of baffling technological betrayal. It was a clear night, perfectly clear. Our METOX was silent. We knew the patrol planes were out there, but our system guaranteed us distance. When the depth charges hit, it wasn't fire it was pure, horrifying confusion. We were taught the English couldn't see us. The sound we did hear, the standard ping, was too far away to matter. But the blast was right on top of us.
The core of our
Commander Richter died
world,
screaming about a silent enemy. He felt betrayed by the dark. We realized the equipment we trusted had lied to us. It registered static, not a threat. A signal ignored for just a few minutes changed the entire plan. For Voss, the technical failure was a spiritual collapse. The German technological superiority was not just countered, it was mocked on the German side. The commander-in-chief in the region, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, viewed the U-boat losses with frustration, not alarm. He focused on the land battle, trusting the naval command to solve its own operational issues. His decisions were driven by the flawed intelligence that the Allied convoys were arriving randomly, driven by luck, not precision. Kesselring's memoir later revealed the immense pressure he faced from Berlin, coupled with his own unshakable arrogance regarding German technology. He couldn't conceive that Allied science had leapfrogged his own engineers. We believed our flak defenses were adequate, our anti-radar systems superb. The losses were regrettable, yes, but attributable to tactical errors in the hands of the captains. No one in command dared suggest that the basic premise of our chronic intelligence that Matox was the best could be wrong. To admit that would have been to admit the entire Mediterranean defense plan was built on sand. This high-level denial forced commanders to make dangerous, overly aggressive tactical decisions on land to compensate for naval losses they fundamentally misunderstood. The refusal to consider a technological twist sealed the fate of the entire German deployment in Italy. The Allied perspective was one of quiet, almost smug confidence. The introduction of the ASV Mk3 radar was a triumph of electronic warfare. The head of the RAF's coastal command later described the psychological effect the new technology had on their pilots. Before the Mk3, a U-boat hunt was a terrifying gamble. With the new system, it was methodical slaughter. The ASV Mk3, especially with its modified ghost frequency mode, rendered the Matox receiver not just useless, but actively misleading. This system allowed the pilots to approach U-boats in absolute electronic silence relative to German receivers. The strengths were invisibility and precision. The weakness was only its limited range. But paired with the deception frequency, its effectiveness soared. The Ghost radar was a tactical masterpiece, assuring the convoys carrying the 40,000 men the core of the
Once
invasion.
the center collapsed,
Fours would arrive largely
the entire
unscathed.
strategy
This tiny piece of
dissolved
equipment
into
created
dust.
a vacuum of information that the enemy, blind and deaf, could not fill. The use of deception radar, creating a false sense of security for the enemy, raised silent ethical questions among the Allied scientists and military planners. Was it morally acceptable to exploit an enemy's trust in their own life-saving technology? General Patton, known for his blunt approach, dismissed these concerns. The object of war is not to die for your country, but to make the other bastard die for his. However, the scientists understood the weight of their invention. For them, it was simple arithmetic, saving thousands of Allied lives. Justified the use of psychological warfare and technological tricks. The Ghost radar was viewed as a humanitarian weapon because it reduced the need for costly, high-casualty frontal assaults. It shifted the cost of war onto the enemy's mental state and supply lines rather than onto Allied soldiers' bodies. This complex ethical calculus underpinned the entire secret war survival. Above all else was the priority. The final. Critical perspective belonged to the intelligence officers who watched the catastrophic German reaction unfold. German intelligence, relying solely on Matox intercepts and standard reconnaissance, provided Berlin with constant false data. They reported that Allied naval movements were disorganized and easily tracked. This false assurance became a trap. An Allied intelligence report noted, "The enemy is not only blind to our presence, they are being actively reassured by their own obsolete systems that all is well. They are drowning in their own false sense of security." It's intelligence coup, achieved through the simple manipulation of radio waves, meant every strategic decision made by the German command was fundamentally flawed. But the next person told a completely different story. One of internal sabotage and outright betrayal at the highest level of Italian command, and through these conflicting voices, a fractured truth began to emerge. The battlefield was not defined by the size of the tanks, but by the smallest, most secret signal. The true measure of the German collapse in the Mediterranean was the frantic, often contradictory, directives emanating from the Axis High Command. Field Marshal Kesselring and Italian General Alfredo Guzzoni, the commander of the forces in Sicily, were locked in a tension-filled dispute exacerbated by the unseen electronic war. Guzzoni, facing crumbling coastal defenses and poor morale, continually requested immediate German armor support. Kesselring, however, adhering to Hitler's centralized command structure, refused to release the panzer divisions for local counterattacks. Convinced that the main Allied thrust was still aimed at the Balkans or Sardinia, a belief reinforced by the effectiveness of Operation Mincemeat, the intelligence officers, blind to the ghost radar and the decimation of U-boats, could offer no decisive proof of the Sicilian inevitability. This bureaucratic paralysis, the conflict between Führerprinzip, leader principle, military necessity, meant critical German armor was held static inland, while the Allied invasion secured its beachheads. The resulting delayed counterattack was too little, too late, ensuring that the 40,000 elite German soldiers would be fighting a protracted, losing battle on Italian soil. The Allied tactical innovation was not solely the radar. It was the immediate, aggressive exploitation of the intelligence vacuum the radar created. Allied Air Command shifted from defensive patrol to precision ground attack, using their electronic invisibility to strike German armor concentrations and supply lines with impunity. This was the first major campaign where air power, guided by technologically superior ASVMK-3 and detailed aerial photos, dictated the flow of a ground battle so completely. In contrast, German tactics remained rigid. Their reliance on swift, overwhelming counterattacks, a tactic perfected in the early war. Blitzkrieg failed because the element of surprise was stolen by a radio wave.
Yes, sir.
Every planned deployment was shadowed, every movement anticipated. The fundamental lesson learned by the Allies, and misinterpreted by the Axis, was that in modern warfare, the true front line is the spectrum of electromagnetic waves. For the Italian civilian population, the war was transforming from a distant political concept into a brutal, visceral reality. Propaganda, both Allied and Axis, struggled to contain the psychological fallout of the invasion. Fascist media promised total victory and Italian resilience, while Allied leaflets dropped by the same planes using the ghost technology promised liberation. The sight of massive Allied convoys, arriving unscathed and delivering overwhelming power, instantly shattered the facade of Italian military strength. Civilians witnessed the demoralized Italian soldiers surrendering in droves, contrasted sharply with the grim, determined fighting retreat of the Germans. This dramatic contrast forced a societal reckoning. The war was no longer about national glory. It was about survival, and which side could offer better odds. Who truly won this war? For the people of Sicily, the winners were simply those who survived the artillery, barrages, and the inevitable retreat. The media war was where the internal tension played out visibly. German newsreels continued to show heroic U-boat commanders sinking massive Allied tonnage long after the reality of the ghost radar had decimated the fleet. This deliberate distortion served only to deepen the shock and betrayal. When the full extent of the military failure became undeniable, the false reporting created a hidden tension. The public was fed lies of victory, while the command structure knew the terrifying truth of technological inferiority, but was forbidden to admit it. This gap between propaganda and reality was the final, devastating collapse of the Axis psychological defense. All narratives converged toward a single, irreversible moment: the massive, visible deployment of the Allied invasion force, made possible by the silent, invisible triumph of a single, unnoticed radio frequency. The stillness of the sea on the night of July 9, 1943, was the silence before the great historical collapse. For Commander Ernst Kruger, positioned with the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division near Gela, Sicily, the night was tense but deceptively ordinary. His division was poised to deliver the crucial counterattack against the American landings. Intelligence reports, still polluted by the blindness to the ghost radar, assured him that the main Allied assault fleet was scattered and vulnerable. The German command's primary directive was to wait for confirmation of the landing's exact strength. then strike with overwhelming force, driving the invaders back into the sea within 48 hours. The initial reports came in: American paratroopers dropping in disorganized clusters due to severe winds. This was the moment German command laughed. They interpreted the chaos as Allied incompetence, a sign that the invasion was poorly planned and easily defeated.
The northern sector.
Kruger felt a surge of confidence,
Just as
a
planned.
belief that German
We shall
tactical
crush them.
superiority would once again prevail. He ordered his lead regiments to advance to staging areas, preparing for the dawn assault. But beneath the expected movements, the electronic deception was executing its most devastating trick. Allied destroyer escorts, guided by the precise, undetected ASV-Mk3 radar, were not only guarding the convoys, but were actively searching for the few German motor torpedo boats and submarines that slipped through the net. The key signal was not one of detection, but one of non-detection. The German radar systems near the coast, still listening for the loud, predictable
Sonar
frequencies of
contact
old,
bearing 180.
reported absolute silence
Range
in the
closing.
surrounding sea air,
Weapons.
reinforcing
Stand
the
by.
German High Command's belief that the Allies were still far offshore or completely unaware of their defensive position.
Then came the first critical breakpoint. At 3 o'clock hours, a tiny Allied patrol boat, guided by its ghost frequency radar, stumbled upon a massive German supply depot hidden deep in a coastal inlet near Licata. The depot was crucial, holding the fuel and ammunition necessary for Kruger's panzer counterattack. Without hesitating, the patrol boat radioed the location. Within minutes, the prearranged naval bombardment began, not as a random shelling, but as a surgical strike. A massive barrage from Allied battleships shattered the pre-dawn quiet. The shells rained down with terrifying accuracy. The first round struck the depot, triggering secondary explosions that lit up the entire coastline. The sight was horrific. A colossal fireball confirming to Kruger that the enemy was not disorganized, but terrifyingly aware of his exact positions. His vital supply of fuel, enough to cover the advance of his 40,000 men, was gone. 10-9-8. The single, silent ping from the undetected Allied radar had sealed the fate of the counterattack before a single German tank could fire its main gun. The Germans were stunned not by the magnitude of the attack, but by its impossible precision. Commander Kruger grabbed his comrade's hand, heart racing as the blinding light from the explosions stung his eyes. The element of surprise had been utterly negated by an enemy he couldn't see, hear, or track. This instantaneous loss of logistical capacity transformed the intended swift counterattack into a slow, grinding battle of attrition where the Germans would constantly be starved of fuel and ammunition. The silence after the storm lasted only minutes before the first waves of American troops, now confident their flanks were protected by the overwhelming naval fire, began to push inland. The shockwave from the burning supply depot near Licata was followed by the devastating realization at the German army headquarters in Italy that the battlefield had fundamentally changed. This was the peak crisis. Commander Kruger's delayed and now fuel-starved counterattack on the American beachhead at Gela began in the morning, launched by Panzer Grenadiers and elements of the Hermann Göring Division. The German soldiers fought with characteristic ferocity, pushing the American forces back to the very edge of the landing zone. Yet their momentum was doomed to fail. The German force was critically low on artillery ammunition and relied entirely on localized fuel caches, which were quickly depleted. Their powerful tanks were soon reduced to static pillboxes. The immediate outcome of the Ghost radar's technological victory was the overwhelming, unopposed superiority of Allied naval gunfire. As German armor advanced, Allied spotters, guided by aerial reconnaissance that the German command could not track or jam, called in fire from cruisers and destroyers sitting safely out of range of Axis coastal guns. The Allied ships fired over 1,800 tons of ordnance into the German lines in a single morning. This barrage was not possible without the prior, silent destruction of the German U-boat defenses in the Strait of Messina and the paralyzing ignorance created by the frequency deception. The German attack, initially a crushing success on the ground, was simply shelled into oblivion. General Hans Valentin Hube, commander of the German 14 Panzer Corps, watched in disbelief as his best armored battalions were systematically destroyed from the sea. His radio logs, recovered years later, record a tone of increasing desperation. The enemy knows our every move. The fire is impossibly precise. It is not an attack. It is an execution. Hube, relying on standard radar and visual confirmation, could not fathom how the enemy could spot units concealed miles inland. The very air seemed to betray them. This operational collapse forced a major, disastrous decision from Field Marshal Kesselring. Convinced that Jela was a diversion, and facing the continued paralysis caused by the unseen electronic war, he ordered a large portion of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division to disengage from the critical fighting and move east toward Catania, believing the main threat lay there. This order, based on fundamentally flawed intelligence, fragmented the German defense and ceded all tactical initiative to the Allies. If they hadn't given that order, committing fully to the Jela counterattack might have succeeded in forcing a localized tactical defeat. Would history be different? The decision was a turning point. It solidified the Allied beachhead and allowed the 40,000 men of the invasion force to pour ashore, their logistical trains secured by the invisible electronic shield. The cost of technological arrogance was paid in blood and lost ground. Declassified records later revealed that a German intelligence officer had, in fact, briefly logged an unusual, high-frequency chatter during the Jela counterattack, but his report was filed under atmospheric anomalies and was never forwarded to the High Command because it did not match the established threat profile dictated by the outdated METOX analysis. This final twist, a near miss at the moment of peak crisis, reinforced the narrative of self-inflicted strategic blindness. When the smoke finally cleared over Jela, the shattered German and Italian lines began a long, weary, and inevitable retreat toward Messina. The world was no longer the same. The age of electronic superiority had begun, and the Axis was already a decade behind. The immediate tactical consequences of the Ghost radar's silent triumph were profound and irreversible. The successful Allied landings in Sicily, secured by an air-sea defense that the Germans could neither track nor counter, led directly to the rapid collapse of Italian resistance. Within 38 days, Sicily was secured. The initial strategic blindness, the German command laughed at the notion of Allied electronic superiority, cascaded into a devastating series of tactical defeats. The most immediate impact was the preservation of Allied supply lines. The 40,000 men of the invasion force, along with their staggering logistical train, arrived almost entirely without loss to U-boat attack, a feat unimaginable just months before. This meant sustained combat power and an unprecedented ability to apply continuous pressure. For the German forces, the consequences were a debilitating resource drain and a psychological rupture. The loss of U-boats in the Mediterranean continued unabated, forcing the Kriegsmarine to withdraw its remaining units from the region, effectively ceding control of the sea lanes to the Allies. On land, the absence of fuel and the destruction of the supply depots at the critical moment meant that German armor, the linchpin of their defense, was neutralized. Commander Kruger's division and others were forced into a fighting retreat, abandoning heavy equipment and sacrificing mobility. Their battle was no longer about victory, but about survival and the desperate attempt to evacuate across the Strait of Messina. This loss of equipment and experienced troops, the core of the German presence in Italy, directly weakened their subsequent defenses in mainland Italy. The human cost, however, transcended the strategic maps. For the German soldiers, there was the constant, crushing knowledge of fighting a blind war. The morale of the troops, particularly the U-boat crews and coastal defense units, plummeted. They were not defeated by superior courage, but by an unseen enemy in the airwaves. Diaries of German officers spoke not of brave Allied assaults, but of a terrifying sense of helplessness. "We fight ghosts," wrote a grenadier officer in late July. "We are shelled before we move, bombed before we hide. It is not war. It is a deadly demonstration of clairvoyance." The Ghost radar had succeeded in breaking the enemy's will, a victory more valuable than territory. The eventual retreat from Sicily saw over 100,000 German and Italian troops evacuated. But the price was the complete loss of all heavy equipment and the demoralization that paved the way for the later, easier Allied advance up the Italian peninsula. Among the forgotten details of this massive military operation were the individuals caught in the crossfire. Allied intelligence was so effective that entire German field hospitals were located and, controversially, often bypassed or shelled to prevent their use as command centers. Conversely, the high volume of German prisoners, over 140,000 Axis soldiers captured in Sicily, posed a massive logistical and humanitarian challenge for the Allies. For the nurses and medical staff, the war became an unending stream of traumatized, defeated men who couldn't explain how they were defeated. They saw not arrogant conquerors, but men who had been utterly confused by their enemy's invisibility. The cost was paid not just in deaths. Allied casualties were approximately 23,000, significantly lower than initial projections, thanks to the intelligence advantage, but in the shattering of faith in German technological superiority, the very belief system that fueled their fighting spirit. This technological and psychological defeat in Sicily had a direct, devastating echo back in Germany, contributing to the growing public realization that the war was turning against them. The high rate of U-boat losses, the famed Grey Wolves of the Atlantic, was kept secret, but the constant need for replacements and the visible grief in naval towns could not be hidden. The defeat at Gela and the successful invasion of the European mainland marked the end of the war's turning point. The tide had definitively shifted. Back then, warfare relied on pure radio wave manipulation. Now we face threats from sophisticated AI and cyber warfare, yet the core principle remains identical. The side that controls the information spectrum controls the battle. The Allied technological victory, secured by the silent ghost radar, was only the cost the world could see. The true, lingering cost was the deep wound inflicted upon the German military psyche, a wound that would bleed throughout the rest of the conflict. The strategic collapse driven by the ghost radar in 1943 had long-term impacts that reshaped the rest of World War II and permanently altered the landscape of military doctrine. The first major long-term consequence was the acceleration of the Italian campaign. Mussolini was deposed and arrested within weeks of the Sicilian invasion's success, a political shockwave directly attributable to the military defeat secured by the Allies' electronic superiority. Italy, subsequently, became a protracted battleground, but one where the Allies always maintained air and sea superiority, a dominance guaranteed by their early technological lead in radar and counter-radar measures. This shifted crucial German divisions, including the reserves needed for the Eastern Front and the defense of France, into the Italian theater, exactly the diversionary effect the Allies had intended. Furthermore, the silent massacre of the U-boat fleet in the Mediterranean forced the German High Command to finally acknowledge the Allied technological advantage, albeit too late. This belated recognition triggered the frantic, expensive race to develop new countermeasures, such as the Naxos radar detector, but by then, the Allies were already years ahead in the electronic spectrum, continually shifting frequencies and developing new jamming techniques faster than the Axis could respond. The lesson was learned. Technological stagnation, especially in intelligence and communication, means certain defeat in modern conflict. The arrogance that led the German command laughed at early reports was replaced by the desperation of fighting a technologically reactive war, burning vital resources on catching up rather than innovating. The long-term impact on Allied doctrine was equally profound. The success of Operation Husky served as the crucial blueprint for the future Normandy landings, D-Day. It validated the use of massive deception, Operation Fortitude, the critical necessity of air and sea superiority before landing, and, most importantly, the vital role of electronic warfare, EW, in neutralizing enemy command and control. The experiences in Sicily, particularly the effectiveness of the unseen radar, were directly incorporated into the planning for D-Day, where the Allies deployed over 1,000 aircraft dedicated solely to jamming and deception, creating a massive electronic fog that further blinded the German defenses in France. The fate of the war was sealed not by the sheer number of soldiers, but by the ability to manage and exploit the electromagnetic spectrum. The human lesson drawn from Sicily was that even the most determined soldier, the most formidable defense, is vulnerable when intelligence fails. The 40,000 men who fought and died on the German side were victims of a command structure that prioritized belief over fact, dogma over scientific inquiry. Furthermore, the silent massacre of the U-boat fleet in the Mediterranean forced the German High Command to finally acknowledge the Allied technological advantage, albeit too late. This belated recognition triggered the frantic, expensive race to develop new countermeasures, such as the Naxos radar detector, but by then, the Allies were already years ahead in the electronic spectrum, continually shifting frequencies and developing new jamming techniques faster than the Axis could respond. The lesson was learned. Technological stagnation, especially in intelligence and communication, means certain defeat in modern conflict. The arrogance that led the German command laughed at early reports was replaced by the desperation of fighting a technologically reactive war, burning vital resources on catching up rather than innovating. The long-term impact on Allied doctrine was equally profound. The success of Operation Husky served as the crucial blueprint for the future Normandy landings, D-Day. It validated the use of massive deception, Operation Fortitude, the critical necessity of air and sea superiority before landing, and, most importantly, the vital role of electronic warfare, EW, in neutralizing enemy command and control. The experiences in Sicily, particularly the effectiveness of the unseen radar, were directly incorporated into the planning for D-Day, where the Allies deployed over 1,000 aircraft dedicated solely to jamming and deception, creating a massive electronic fog that further blinded the German defenses in France. The fate of the war was sealed not by the sheer number of soldiers, but by the ability to manage and exploit the electromagnetic spectrum. The human lesson drawn from Sicily was that even the most determined soldier, the most formidable defense, is vulnerable when intelligence fails. The 40,000 men who fought and died on the German side were victims of a command structure that prioritized belief over fact, dogma over scientific inquiry.